We're going to have a look overseas again, as the US seems to be a great example of how rail freight can be a competitive mode of transport. We're going to talk with Russell Pittman, who is the Director of Economic Research in the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice. And Russell, are you with us?
I am with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Russell, thank you.
Pleasure to be at my second Traxxas Charges Summit.
Welcome. And we mentioned that there were some people from the US. I think you, where in the US are you based?
I'm in Washington, D.C. If you look behind me, I must correct you. Unfortunately, it is not 4 p.m.
That's what I was afraid of, because I saw you nodding. What time is it there now?
4:30 a.m.
Wow. Okay, all the respect to you. You woke up for the Traxxas charges. Thank you very much. Russell, you drew a comparison between the US and Europe. And you said that in US, rail freight owes a lot to the Staggers deal. Could you explain why that is?
Well, in the U.S., as many of you probably know, we have a very different rail freight system. We have vertically integrated railways. The railway companies own their track, own their infrastructure, and mostly run their own trains on their track. The same is similar in Canada and Mexico and Brazil. So I think of this as the North American system. We until 1980, from the creation of the railways in the 1800s, there was heavy regulation to protect what were seen as very vulnerable farmers, small manufacturers, citizens from the monopolistic abuses of the railways. Gradually, the railways, under heavy regulation and, of course, increasing competition from other modes, lost their monopoly power with respect to many shippers, and they were in serious financial trouble starting about in the 60s. And so by 1980, there had been a series of minor deregulation bills passed, or partial deregulation. By 1980, the freight system was very much deregulated, substantially deregulated. And the results, as are on one of my slides that I think you're going to show, were just dramatic in terms of productivity going up, of prices going down, of volume going up. Eventually, profits went well. I think the profits are not on that graph, but profits were quite healthy and growing, and now are quite healthy. And so it's been one of the world's, I would say, success stories in terms of both keeping the railways healthy and in reversing what had been a very perceptible decline in rail's share of freight. It has now been going back up since 1980, whereas it had been declining continuously since at least the 1930s. And we'll talk about this more maybe if we have time, but I think one of the lessons, obviously there are many differences between the US and the North American systems and the European systems, and I don't minimize those at all. But I think one of our big advantages has been that our infrastructure is mostly privately funded, because the railway companies own their infrastructure, or in Mexico and Brazil, they don't own it, but they control it. And so they have the incentive to invest really tens of billions of dollars throughout the continent of private money into the infrastructure. And I think it's what has been a very important factor in resuming freight's rail's share, increasing share of freight, not of passengers, unfortunately, but of freight. And I think it's something that, if you were, people at the Access Summit in Riga last year heard me say, boy, in Europe, I don't tell you what to do from America. But boy, if you could figure out a way to attract more private investment into the infrastructure, I think that would be a big key.
Yeah, and I think it becomes very clear if we look at a similar development that happened in Europe when it comes to rail freight. And you've also shown this in another slide of yours, because in Europe we had deregulation too.
Yes, I hesitate to talk about this in front of a group of people who know about this much better than I, but I was using the I'm using the results of a paper that I recently published with several European colleagues on the share of rail in agricultural in grain haulage in Eastern Europe, for the most part, was our focus. But we were talking about the broader issue as well, looking at the 4 packages, looking at what the policy of the EC was going back to the first package in terms of trying to increase interoperability and promote the union, but also trying to increase competition and above the rail. And one of the things that we found in the countries we were looking at specifically, and in the great data that the EC itself puts together, is that the policy on the freight side, especially, was what we looked at was quite successful in creating competition above the rail in a number of countries. Very significant share of the non-incumbent in freight, and yet the share of rail continued to fall. And so that was, one of the conclusions that I'll admit I kind of pushed into that paper as well, as well. You created competition, very successful, well done, probably promoted efficiency as I understand it, but you weren't able to prevent the continued drop of rail share. And so again, I come back to my message of it's the infrastructure that maybe needs a lot more money. The problem may be not above the rail, but below the rail.
Yeah.
Again, with apologies that I'm talking about a continent that everybody listening to me knows much better than I.
And we're now showing your slide, your third slide, in which you say the private money is out there. Rail companies, infrastructure managers, and policymakers need to find a way to use it.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you look at the left of that slide, you see the figure from the Association of American Railroads. Again, tens of billions in the U.S. alone, not even counting Canada, Mexico, Brazil. Tens of billions of dollars every year of private investment in the infrastructure. The companies are listed on the stock exchange. They raise money. They spend it. They do get some government help occasionally, but by far the most of the infrastructure spending comes directly from their shareholders.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's an interesting question for the listening audience. Why is it not happening in Europe? Why we're not able to attract private investment? Who knows? Maybe somebody knows. Would you be able to give an answer to that question?
My own answer is that it's kind of inherent in it's probably inherent in the government ownership of the infrastructure, because throughout the world, not just in Europe, but everywhere, governments are unreliable sources of continuous funding for infrastructure. Every year, the parliament has to allocate money, and every year the pensioners need it and the military needs it, and golly, the track will last another year. And just all over the world, Russia, Ukraine, India, Europe, governments cannot be counted on to fund rail infrastructure to the degree that it needs to be.